I have decided to do a series of videos on the American Transcendentalists, specifically Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, mainly because I think their work is very relevant in our current confusing and challenging times and gives us clues on how to think clearly and live with integrity when all of the established institutions, government, the news organizations, academia, and intellectuals, writers, artists, pundits on Twitter all seem to be either brainwashed by partisan politics or to be using partisan politics, or at least a kind of canned thinking and rhetoric for personal gain and status, or to hide behind so that their advantages aren't taken away. Also, I should say that there are personal reasons for my fancying these two writers. I was born and raised on Staten Island, New York. I lived there until I was 35 years old. In both of these writers have ties to the island. Emerson's brother, William, served as county court judge there, and Emerson secured for a 25-year-old Thoreau a position in 1834 as a live-in tutor for William's kids. So Thoreau lived on Staten Island for about 6 months in an area that is now known as Emerson Hill. At that time, Staten Island was really just this remote farming community. It had a lot of hills and woods and gorgeous virgin coastline, and Thoreau would go on these long walks and marvel at the scenery, and they say that this period in his life helped him consolidate his ideas on what he would later call contemplation, which would reach at least its literary culmination 20 years later in 1854 when he published his masterpiece, Walden, Life in the Woods. I will also discuss that book in this series of videos on Transcendentalism. But today we are going to talk about his seminal and controversial essay on the Duty of Civil Disobedience, which was published 5 years before Walden in 1849, and which ended up influencing huge historical figures like Leo Tolstoy, Mahatma Gandhi, and Martin Luther King. So basically, this son of a pencil manufacturer from Concord, Massachusetts, this guy who lived by his wits and his guts and perhaps a few advantages to make sure that he dedicated most of his time to thinking and reading and writing, this guy had an impact on some of the most admirable movers and shakers in the modern era. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to define Transcendentalism as the belief that we can understand divine will in truth by our attentiveness to the world around us. And the less buffers and obstacles that we put between ourselves and raw, authentic nature, the more clearly and strongly that divine will and truth comes across to us. To live according to the Transcendentalist beliefs requires basically two things: the simplification of our lives and self-reliance. Self-Reliance is the title of perhaps Ralph Waldo Emerson's most famous essay, which we will also look at in this series of videos. But basically the idea is that the more that we depend solely on ourselves to feed our bodies and minds, and the less that we avail ourselves of what institutions and the majority and groupthink have to offer, the better for our integrity and for our clarity of thought. According to Thoreau, government perhaps compromises us most of all. On the Duty of Civil Disobedience opens with the following line: I heartily accept the motto, that government is best which governs least. And then he basically goes on to ask, what happens when we cannot without disgrace be associated with the government? I mean, what happens then? What happens when, as he puts it, my government is the slave's government? Now remember, at that time, in the mid-19th century, the U.S., slavery was still legal in the U.S., and the U.S. was involved in the Mexican-American War. They were the aggressors in seizing land from Mexico, and not just a little bit of land, like 500,000 square miles. I mean, check out a map of the U.S. in 1845 before the Mexican-American War. And Thoreau very poignantly points out that the American Revolution, the War for Independence in 1775, when, you know, the people rose up to protest against Britain imposing taxes on certain goods that, according to Thoreau, he could have done without, he says that those circumstances were a less legitimate cause for revolution than when the government is committing oppression with slavery and robbing land with war. He writes, "There are thousands who are in opinion opposed to slavery and to war, who yet in effect do nothing to put an end to them. They hesitate and they regret, and sometimes they petition, but they do nothing in earnest and with effort." And then a bit later he writes this very telling line, "They only give a cheap vote." In this essay, Thoreau seems to question the validity of a democracy that doesn't allow for individuals to, let's say, be conscientious objectors to certain policies that incriminate us or that make us accomplices in crimes, all right? He writes, "Men generally under such a government as this think that they ought to wait until they have persuaded the majority to alter them being these policies that implicate us." And then a bit later he writes, "They think that if they should resist, the remedy would be worse than the evil. But it is the fault of the government itself that the remedy is worse than the evil. It makes it worse." And then he adds, "The ways which the state has provided for remedying the evil take too much time." And then he boldly proposes that we withdraw from the co-partnership by breaking the law. He very eloquently and unequivocally writes that a prison is the only house in a slave state in which a free man can abide with honor. When I read that, I thought of these two guys. Okay, according to Thoreau, how do we withdraw from this co-partnership? What is the most effective way to break the law? Well, according to Thoreau, it's by withholding our taxes. He writes, "If 1,000 men were not to pay their tax bills this year, that would not be a violent and bloody measure as it would be to pay them and enable the state to commit violence and shed innocent blood. That is, in fact, the definition of a peaceable revolution, if any such is possible." Right? He points out how much more difficult it is for the rich and comfortable to be civilly disobedient. The rich man, he writes, is always sold to the institution that makes him rich. And he claims that it is impossible for a man to live honestly and at the same time comfortably in outward aspects. And by outward, I suspect that he means material. And this is where the idea of reducing our lives down to the essentials, of simplifying our lives, right? One of the core beliefs of Transcendentalism, this is where it comes into play. Because, you know, the less that we owe to a government, or really any institution, to even political ideology, or to academia, or to a company, or to a church, or even to our family, like the less we depend on them, the more free we are to live by the rules of our conscience. You know, he makes this fascinating, or gives this fascinating interpretation of that line of Christ in the Gospels when he says, "Render therefore to Caesar that which is Caesar's, and to God those things which are God's." I've always read that line interpreted as sort of like we have to learn to compartmentalize, that we have to give both God and the state their due and their importance and even their praise. But Thoreau really kind of turns that on its head and says, like, the more we take from Caesar, the more we owe to him. And that interpretation of that gospel passage is so much more demanding on us, but at the same time, it kind of gives us an out as far as like the moral quandary or quagmire of like living in collusion with or as an accomplice to the state's crimes. I mean, and America is still committing heinous crimes. If you don't think that, then you're just not paying attention. I mean, take your pick. Okay, so here's how I think that we can realistically, or maybe let's say how we can moderately apply Thoreau's ideas in his essay on civil disobedience to our lives. Basically, it's better to just get by economically, or to live as though we're just getting by economically, right? As Emerson said of his mentee Thoreau, he chose to be rich by making his wants few. That line to me encapsulates the value of the liberal arts. I mean, if we really have an affection for ideas and creativity and art and debate and truth, if we really get fired up by that stuff, then we don't need what wealth can buy to be happy. I mean, I can be happy with just the people I love, my notebooks, my library, perhaps YouTube, perhaps Spotify, perhaps Twitter, to lead me to the people who have interesting things to say, right? I can be happy with just that. I mean, there's one other line I want to quote from Thoreau. He writes, "If a man is thought-free, fancy-free, and imagination-free," right? Basically, if a man is free to use his thoughts and his taste and his imagination, basically as he wishes, then get this great line, then unwise rulers and reformers cannot fatally interrupt him. I mean, fuck yeah. Look, Thoreau admits in the piece that his ass was covered by benefactors the 2 times that he was called on to pay taxes under the threat of imprisonment. The pages that he writes about the night that he spent in prison, that's not the best part of the piece. The sacrifices that he made for his beliefs kind of appealed to his character and to his personal interests and objectives. When he writes, for instance, that if he couldn't live by his nature, he preferred to die, it just doesn't have the same impact as it would if it had been written by someone who had suffered more oppression for his or her beliefs. But that does not take away from the tremendous insight, relevance, and rigor of his ideas. I mean, I read on the duty of civil disobedience, and I feel almost calmed by the logic and the sense of it. I'll put a link to it below. It's only 28 pages. You should read it. It's a primary text that helped make the world a better place. And I think it's especially worth reading now because we, as Americans, at least, all right, feel more implicated than ever by the cruel and cynical circus that the American democracy has devolved into, the travesty of freedom that it embodies and espouses, no matter what party is running things. Because I suspect, at least, that it's an oligarchy of power mongers who are running things. But as I say, this essay by Thoreau calmed me because you almost get the impression that it's always been like this. Okay? We just have to keep plugging away, keep digging away, keep building our little humble sandbox worlds and making them as kind and as just as possible, and not counting on, not depending on government or any large institution for help, because they're only going to butt in, okay, and make self-serving demands on us, and that will sacrifice the integrity of our projects and our lives. You know, I'm going to finish this video with a quote that Thoreau includes from Confucius. If a state is governed by principles of reason, poverty and misery are subjects of shame. If a state is not governed by principles of reason, riches and honors are subjects of shame. It seems to me that more and more Americans are ashamed by their riches and honors, and they're ashamed by the country and the connections that gave them the opportunities to become rich or illustrious or comfortable, let's say. You know, who knows? Maybe their shame is justified. Maybe there's good reason for their shame.